Hi, Jimmy. This is Umair. I'm host of Better Tech, and we invite leaders like you, tech leaders and other leaders like you, to have a conversation and figure out what is happening in the tech, where the world is heading, and what we should know that we don't know today. So welcome on the show, and let's have a great conversation today. So just to kickstart things, how about you take a few minutes and introduce yourself, about your background and what you're doing these days?
Mayor, yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me. This is super exciting. My name is Jimmy Mesta. I am the co-founder and CTO of a infrastructure security company called KSOC. So we operate in the Kubernetes security space. I've been doing application and infrastructure security for about almost 15 years now. So I've done a lot, seen a lot, have some hopes for the future, but we'll see. We'll talk about those today.
Sure, no, that's wonderful. So our today's topic largely revolves around security in the cloud native environments. So, I mean, let's try to keep it a little more on a higher level. Help us break down what is a cloud native environment and what does really security mean in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I've lived this throughout my career. So kind of my very first job out of college was doing application security, but we had a data center, right? So we ran, it was next to my office. I was plugging in servers. I was building this program around, what was a data center centric environment. And over the course of my career, what we've seen happen is this shift towards the big public cloud environments, right? And it wasn't overnight, but it happened slowly, and security kind of had to adapt, right? We had to figure out like what's different here. And to me, cloud native is really the advent of, everything is an API. So what was kind of a program where we had to take a server, plug it in, configure it. You have a crash cart, all these things. Now everything is done through automation and software and working with APIs, right? So it's really changed the model of security in that, we're very much in a ephemeral sort of environment that changes every second of the day. And we have to learn how to adapt to this kind of API driven approach. And it's across all clouds now, right? There's many different ways to do cloud native in different offerings.
Whether it's a public cloud or a private cloud, it applies in that particular way, right?
Yeah, I think so, right? It's private cloud, public cloud, hybrid cloud, right? These kind of these kind of topics are really broad sweeping statements, but they're all kind of API driven, right? You're using tools that are built for those environments versus taking what once worked in a data center and just kind of plopping it over onto an AWS EC2 instance, for example. So it's different. Yeah, the world's changed quite a bit.
So and we'll talk about security in a bit, but when you say public clouds like AWS or Azure, or for that matter GCP, I mean, from a layman's perspective or a typical CEO's perspective, they are renting everything from Amazons and Googles of the world. And shouldn't they already be secure because they're already scalable, because they're already, they give an uptime guarantee, they give lots of such over-the-top facilities. So shouldn't they already be secure?
I feel like that's a good segue question. The answer is it depends, and also no, right? Because the whole model for any public cloud is kind of based on your shared responsibility, right? It's called the shared responsibility model inside of AWS specifically, where your public cloud provider has certain responsibilities when it comes to security, privacy, compliance, et cetera, of their cloud environment, right? Think about physical security. That's not on you or I using this service, as well as hiring guards that sit out front of the data centers, and a lot of the underlying infrastructure networking that they put into place. But there is a line in the sand where the responsibility then shifts to you, the person, as you said, renting this space. And that was fuzzier in the past, right? It's like, what am I responsible for? Am I compliant just because I'm using AWS? But that's kind of changed, right? The applications and the way you use these environments, that's on you. Like, you can use AWS, which has every certificate known to humankind when it comes to compliance, and be out of compliance, right? Because you've built an application that's misconfigured, that has web application vulnerabilities, that's using old software. There's a variety of ways that you can use these technologies in a very insecure manner. So they do a lot of the foundational security and compliance work for you, and that's great. It's a huge benefit of not building your own data center, but you have to be acutely aware of where your responsibilities still lie.
Great. So now walk us through, what are different types of security one can think about? There's applications, there are infrastructure, there are servers, there are platforms, and then there are third-party integration. So break some of the security for us.
Yeah. I'm a strong believer in the cloud security realm that, identity and access management is kind of at the core. It's at the core of public cloud, right? Like, who can do what and with what resource, right? So at its most kind of basic sort of approach.
So essentially, it's authentication and authorization.
Authn and auth. Yep. Authentication, authorization, and kind of like the monitoring of that access, right? So I am, as a principal we'll pick on AWS, you're building these roles, they're complicated, the ecosystem is vast. And what we see in kind of the land of breaches is things are misconfigured. It's rarely like a 0-day vulnerability that came out on some AWS infrastructure last week. It's, hey, this big customer had an S3 bucket that was misconfigured, or too broadly, the security policies were too broadly applied. It was open to the internet, or this user leaked credentials into a GitHub repository, and somebody logged in, straight up to AWS console and mined cryptocurrency. So foundationally, identity and access management, auth needs to be tight. And that also, kind of enters my realm of Kubernetes, which is a whole different story, but it is hard to get right and hard to know if you're doing it right. And that's really important. And then classic things, CVEs and all that stuff, that's going to exist forever.
So you are part of KSOC, and you're kind of, an expert on the Kubernetes related security. So what does Kubernetes bring to the table? Why it's hard to really configure correctly, and how KSOC is really helping us do that?
Sure. Yeah. So KSOC was born out of Google years ago. Their internal container orchestration system called Borg was kind of gifted to the community. There's a whole documentary on it now, actually, that it's pretty good. You can find it on YouTube. But the promise of Kubernetes was kind of a few different, big points. One is, let's use servers more efficiently, right? At its highest level, containers are a way to package applications, run them alongside other applications, and highly utilize these pretty beefy machines that we have available that usually sit idle, right? If you have a virtual machine, you're rarely using the CPU and RAM available. So Kubernetes is kind of a way to like bin pack or oversubscribe machines to run applications. That's one piece. The second piece is really around like developer flexibility and ergonomics, where containers themselves, without going into crazy detail, offer a way for you to, in theory, run an application stack on your laptop that looks and feels and acts and behaves just like the application stack in your production environment and everywhere in between. And that's a hard problem, right? Like the kind of ephemeral nature and immutable nature of containers make it so they're disposable, right? So you build something locally, push it up to a registry. Ultimately, you need something to run it somewhere, right? And usually like the Docker run command isn't going to be sufficient for a Fortune 500. You're going to need high availability, scalability, you know, horizontally and vertically. You're going to need networking controls, secrets management. There's all of these other pieces that are coming together that, you know, to make a container deliver its promise to the end user, whatever it may be. So Kubernetes really is built to do that, right? It's built to, you know, be the place where containers run, scale, and are tracked. So, and with that comes complications, right? I mean, it's a very flexible system by design. Security wasn't, you know, at the forefront of the Kubernetes project, and it shouldn't have been, but it is something that kind of came out of nowhere for a lot of security folks, right? Where it's like, now we have this other environment over here that doesn't look like this kind of virtual machine centric environment. It's using containers. They come from untrusted sources. The networking's not the same. The secrets management's not the same. There's a lot of things that we've had to kind of reinvent in security when it comes to containerized environments. So that's where we're at today. So
how KSOC really helps everyone who's running a container in terms of security?
Yeah. So KSOC is really a platform to bring, you know, the most frictionless security visibility and remediation to the problems throughout Kubernetes clusters. So today, it's very rare to be running one cluster. It's typically, even the smallest of startups have 3+, right? And that's a kind of hard thing to reason about from a security program. So KSOC, number one, provides visibility into where you're running clusters, how they're configured at the cloud level, right? Is your EKS environment have the right, you know, kind of configurations in place that meet your standards? But also we stream events from inside of the cluster. So this, you know, the Kubernetes API is very noisy. There's things happening as you sleep, right? It's not this static sort of environment. So we've taken this approach that we're going to capture and collect as much data as we can from a security perspective from each of these clusters, provide you with sane kind of out of the box best practice policies that align with lots of different compliance frameworks and regulations, and let you bring your own policies. But on top of that, we're really subscribed and to the GitOps philosophy of like, if you checked something in as code, and it's running in your cluster, we want to go fix the code, right? We don't want to go back to the cluster and like manipulate the runtime, and things get very messy when your security product can actually change the end state of your running application. So we have very tight Git integrations that let us fix problems at the source. And that's kind of the, you know, you wrap that up into a package that's easy to use across multiple clusters for any team really. And you start to really level up your security program inside of these distributed containerized
So when you say you have Git integrations that fix problem at the source, which means that I potentially can include your code or libraries or product while I'm developing stuff, and it will secure as I launch containers or package them, it will already provide me with a secure environment. Is this what you're referring to?
Yeah. So there's a couple, you know, insertion points for security, right? One is like the shift left mantra of do things kind of in CI and on even on the developer laptop. And then there's runtime. And we kind of believe you need both to have like kind of a healthy program, because ideally you wouldn't be logging into Kubernetes using kubectl, manipulating things. But in practice, that's, you know, we see it all the time. So you need controls everywhere. So within the CI process, there is a world where you use the KSOC kind of API framework to run your, you know, we'll call it a GitHub action. You're checking in some code. It's going to go kind of check with your policies that are stored in KSOC and distributed across the clusters, and it'll say, hey, that violates our whole, you know, security model. We're going to break the build, but we're also going to help you kind of come up with something better, right? Something that isn't going to actually just point you to a wiki article. We want to pull out the line of code that is the problem and give you the context on how to fix it.
Okay, great. So Jimmy, now let's. I want to get your a little bit more holistic view that how you have seen threats and the kind of ramp up over the period of last 4 or 5 years, and where would you see them going in the next couple of years, and how the security side of the organization has responded to it in terms of new softwares, new techniques, and new platforms. New kind of processes. So what's your observation is right now?
Yeah, security teams over the past 4 to 5 years, as you mentioned, had to go through a bit of a self-reflection, right, on what's important, because we don't have unlimited staff. There's not like this, it's not a one-to-one with application security and infrastructure security and the rest of the organization. So we have to really automate our jobs. I believe we're seeing a lot of incidents in the cloud, and most of those incidents are stemming from misconfiguration. So we're kind of doing some cleanup work, right? We've already moved to AWS or whatever public cloud you chose. Now we have to kind of go back and do some asset inventory, some kind of security posture management of your cloud. And then Kubernetes is another layer on top of that. And I think security teams who embrace automation and kind of this GitOps philosophy can actually be set up to do better, right? We can't bolt on the old tools we used to use and just hope that that's going to work today. We have to kind of all become part of the development lifecycle, even if you're doing AppSec, infrastructure security, because, contrary to what, we're building a security product for Kubernetes, but if you use Kubernetes correctly with a plan to be secure, it can actually be a lot better off than some of the older legacy sort of solutions we've used. So that's our hope, is to try to guide people down like a safe environment to run any workload.
And generally, what size of organizations really should be start looking into security in a more kind of in much more detail? I mean, the answer to this is obviously it depends. I mean, if you could be a startup, but if you're in a fintech space or something, you need to do it from the get-go. But let's talking about journal, 80 to 90% size of the organization. Do our everyday SMB needs to be so meticulous about security, or is it a startup thing or enterprise thing? What are you seeing in journal as a trend?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's a couple years ago, I feel like you could have put off being serious about security in quotes longer. And now today it's a big part of your business. Like a breach is no joke to customer trust and satisfaction, and it has real impact on your numbers if something were to happen. So it's size is one thing, but even a startup, like you said, they're born in an era where they're going to have to be SOC 2 compliant pretty quickly. Like even KSOC is dealing with some of this stuff today. We're very early stage, and it's like, we're a security product. We want to install in enterprises, and that's just the expectation these days for this type of tooling. So I think it's any company that is utilizing internet technology, which is every company, has to have some level of maturity in the security realm. Whether you bring in like kind of a managed service to help you do that, or you hire your own team, that's a different question. But I think it should be thought about early. And I have a strong belief that developers, you hire a full stack developer. That doesn't mean you write front end and back end code. It means you also understand security, right? And that was not always the case.
Yeah, you bake security right from the get go. It shouldn't be an afterthought, essentially. But
it's an aspect of quality, right?
Yeah. But I wonder how many engineers, out there really understand this part. So we are really talking about like 5% or 10% engineers who actually understand this part. Yeah, and that is why, if had everyone understand it right from the get-go, probably we would not have seen companies like yourself coming out to fix the problem.
Yeah, true. Yeah,
All right.
it's
Yeah.
it's difficult. It's not a and we still need security teams and tools, and we got to bring everything we can to the table at this particular point.
So Jimmy, last question of this podcast, and it could be, you can take your time to answer it, is really, as a CEO, how should I really say, or as a CEO or CTO, whatever, CTO will have different kind of goals, CEO will have different kind of goals, but let's say as a CEO, how should I set up my company or organization, and what roles should be there? What minimal stuff should I do to make sure that I am security compliant, or I'm taking security serious enough for my organization? How I'm really best set up my IT team to, so that I can manage the security threats, or I can work with the security threats of the modern world.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because if you are only focused on security, you're going to spend all your budget on, not making product, right? At the end of the day, it's this balance of like, we have to ship things that customers want and pay for in a secure way. So organizational structure is all over the place today. It's crazy how like where security fits. I'm
thinking from the perspective as well that like, we have started listening. There was just a CEO, then the CTO came along, then the CIO came along. Now we started to hear CISO role. I mean,
Yep.
so the organizations are evolving, but
Yep.
I mean, the larger organizations can have as many Cs as they would want, but for a smaller organization, is there a particular person dedicated to it? I mean, how should I best approach the security?
Yeah. I think doing security as a side project for somebody else who has a day job is a recipe for disaster. Typically, I've been there, right? Where you're like, hey, you kind of are interested in this, the space. Can you just do security also? It's always going to end pretty poorly for that individual and the company. Where I've had success in the past is I've actually been security hire number one at two or three companies now. And the first thing I like to do is get every executive that's willing to listen in the room and do some game day scenarios, right? This isn't a compliance exercise. This isn't scanning things with tools. This is scenario based. What do we do when things hit the fan, right? And that conversation, it's 1 hour, but you have your legal team there. You have your CEO, you have your head of sales, and you go through 4 or 5 scenarios, right? What real ones that could happen. And you ask them, what's the fallout? What would happen? How much money would we lose? Where would our communications fall short? And these scenario-based kind of approaches, doing them even quarterly, will immediately bring problems to the surface, right? The CEO is going to say, like, you're telling me if this thing happens in my AWS environment, it's going to trickle down and we're not going to be able to build this product and sell this thing. And then the listening happens, right? It's like, well, how do we build a real program that's going to prevent this sort of thing? So I think starting with security before compliance is really important. Compliance has its role. We need it. It gives us like a standard kind of communication platform, but it does not guarantee security. So I think, having somebody with kind of this attacker mindset and who's seen bad things happen, having these hard conversations and asking, the executives, like, what's your role during a breach? You have 24 hours. How do you respond? And listen, right? And usually the answer is not great. So I think starting there is pretty interesting. Where it reports doesn't really matter when you're super early, but the key is like, start now. If you're just, if you're listening to this and you don't have a security program, you probably need one.
So essentially what I heard is that you gather people and you run some scenarios, and the probability of that scenario occurs multiplied by the fallout actually gives you an answer that how much you need to spend now and when, how much you need to spend and when on your security program, and security essentially comes before compliance, correct?
Yeah, that's my hot take. Yeah, I mean, compliance usually will ultimately get the line item because you just need it when you need it, but you will be compliant with a very healthy security program, I believe. So yeah, that's my take. I've had success with that.
I think that last part of this has been actually really wonderful. It adds to my knowledge as well, that if you really want to understand that whether you need a security now and how much you need to spend it as a CEO, just run some of these scenarios, think about their probability, think about the fallout, and you know right away whether you can stomach that risk or you need to spend now. Yeah.
That's dollars and cents, right? It's how much are you willing to spend on the insurance that you can minimize it. So yeah.
Thank you, Jimmy. It's, I guess, a wonderful conversation. There's a lot that we can learn further from you, but we just try to keep it a little short to make sure that the interest remains there. So thank you very much for being with us today. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, I'm on Jim Mesta on Twitter. If anybody wants to continue the conversation, happy to chat. Thanks for having me.
Great.